Good evening, everyone. Good to see y'all. See a lot of familiar faces. I see a couple new ones. That's good. And here's the best part, folks. We're doing what we want to do. We've all found the time in our day or our evening to get together and share some time and listen to some stories. Maybe tell some stories. That's what it's all about. Oh, I got some stories for you. Remember, we were all talking about reading some stories from y'all, and sending some in. Well, Sheila from Colorado sent one in, and we're going to read that tonight. It's called A Bigfoot Rescue. This story happened when I was a young girl in the 60s, living in a very small town in Colorado. I don't think I've ever told anyone this story, not even my kids. I had a good imagination growing up, and I just figured my family would think I'd made it up. But I swear to you, this is a true story. I've often thought of it through the years, wondering how I was so lucky to have been saved and grateful that I lived through that night. My mom had a big car. I think it was a Chrysler Plymouth, and nobody back then had snow tires, certainly not studded tires like they do nowadays. We lived in snow country, and my mom avoided driving unless it was an absolute emergency. I remember walking home from school functions in the dark through knee-deep snow because Mom was afraid to come pick me up. She was not a particularly good driver even on the best of roads. Well, we lived in the country, and more often than not, a kind neighbor or a rancher would pick me up and drive me the rest of the way home. Those were the days when you could accept a ride from a stranger and not worry about being kidnapped. It was 1969. It was a cold December evening, and my class was performing a Christmas play in the local church. I really wanted to attend, even though my mom refused to drive me to the event. We had recently had a large snowstorm, and the wind had blown the snow into big, deep drifts. A snowplow had made a pass up our country road, leaving large berms, which would have to be dug out by hand. Mom told me I couldn't go, but I knew my fourth grade classmates were counting on me. Somehow, I had to get to the church and perform my part. My mom was angry that the school and the church hadn't canceled the event. If she didn't feel comfortable driving, she was sure that no one else did either. There were no other kids that lived up on my road. On school mornings, I would hop on the hay truck, and my stepfather would drive me the half-mile down the road to the school bus stop on the highway, where I would wait, alone, for the bus to arrive. The closest other family with kids was a good 2 miles up the highway from us, with forest and meadow pasture in between. The bus gathered all the rural kids, and there were many others like myself that stood at the end of long driveways on rural roads, all alone. I had to come up with a way to get to the event, so I concocted a lie and told my mother that a friend of mine asked her mother to drive out to get me. All I'd have to do is walk out to the highway to my normal bus stop, and she'd pick me up there. I wore my pretty red velvet dress, warm knit stockings, boots, and a coat, and at the last minute I remembered my knit gloves and hat. I wonder now why my mom didn't call my friend's mother to confirm. But she had no reason to think I was lying. Well, I left the house, stomping through snow that was above my knees, out to the end of the driveway where I had to crawl over a large berm of snow that had become encrusted with ice. Once I was on the road, I walked in the tracks the snowplow had made. It was late afternoon, and I knew I had a long walk ahead of me to reach town, but I assumed that once I reached the highway, someone would pick me up and drive me the rest of the way on in. The snow continued to fall and was now coming down in a thick blizzard. I looked behind me and could barely see my tracks. The snow was sticking to my coat and my hat, and I felt the moisture beginning to seep through my knit stockings and gloves. I tucked my hands into my pockets and forged on ahead. I hadn't realized how slow I was walking, taking careful steps to avoid slipping on the ice-encrusted road. It was slick where the snowplow had pushed this blade. Now it was snowing so hard it actually gave me more traction, and I was able to walk just a bit faster. But it was growing dark quickly. I finally made it out to the road, but there were no cars or trucks driving up the highway. So I began walking towards town. It was getting cold now. I was just a scrawny 9-year-old, and I shouldn't have been out on that main highway at night in the snow in December. You might wonder how my mother would have allowed that. And these days that certainly would never have happened. But back then things were just different. I've often heard the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and I have to laugh. It's a wonder any of us survived our childhoods. The highway into town had 2 lanes, one going each direction, but the snowplow had only plowed one way. I walked along the edge of the plowed area, careful to stay as close to the edge as possible. Now I was hoping that a car would catch me in its headlights and stop and give me a ride. But it was scary anyways, and I kept turning around, scanning the road for headlights coming in my direction. I walked for a long distance and was worried that I hadn't seen any cars going by. It was unusual not to see at least a ranch truck driving into town. Also, I was getting tired. My legs ached from the cold and from walking so far. I was worried that if I walked all the way into town, I would get there too late for the play, and everyone would be mad at me. I couldn't keep the tears away. I considered turning around and heading back, but the hopes that a car or a truck would come by and give me a ride kept me moving forward. The snow was coming down so heavy that it was hard to keep my eyes open. The snowflakes were landing on my eyelashes and turning to ice. I kept my head down and watched my feet moving forward in the dark, trying to make sure I was keeping to the edge of the road and not accidentally wandering into the road where I might get hit. Well, where were the cars anyway? As I trudged on, I began to realize that I couldn't see where the snowplow had made its pass any longer. The snow was falling that hard and accumulating at a rapid rate. It was dark, and I was not sure I was even on the road. My imagination took over. I'd seen far too many Twilight Zone episodes, and now I worried that I'd somehow entered another dimension, and that I was forever lost in this darkness of snow and cold. The tears mixed with the snow and froze my eyelashes together so that I had to keep rubbing them with my gloves to keep them open. And still, no cars, no ranch trucks, no one. The silence only fostered the fear that was building inside me and making me imagine that I'd entered an otherworldly realm of science fiction. I had to keep going. How far had I gone? Would it be closer to turn around and head home or keep on walking into town? I knew that the edge of town was approximately 5 miles from my bus stop, and I figured in my young mind that I must have already walked at least half of that. I don't know what it was that I tripped over, but there was something in the road, and I took a hard fall and did a face plant in the snow. I was able to pull myself up and try to dust off the snow, but at that point I was covered in snow and I was wet, I was cold, and I was scared. My young mind was panicking. I thought something had grabbed me and made me fall. I started seeing things in the snow, figures moving and certainly coming to get me. Coyotes, mountain lions, bears, and worst of all, ghosts. And that's what panic does to you when you're 9 years old. I saw lights off in the distance. Only one set, so I knew they were the lights of a house and not the lights of town. I knew if I made my way to that house, they would help me. That's what it was like back then. Neighbors helped neighbors. We even had an organization in town called the Helping Hands. You could sign up as a helping hand, and they gave you an 8.5 by 11 sign to tape in your front window with a big hand on it. As children, we knew that any house that had a helping hand sign in the window meant that you could walk right up, knock on the door, and be welcomed inside whether you needed to use a restroom or their phone or what have you. They also had a welcoming committee. If anyone new moved into town, they'd receive a gift basket full of wonderful baked goods and merchandise from various local stores, along with coupons for free things to introduce themselves to the local merchants. I miss those days when a community really felt like a community. So I left the road and began trudging through the snow towards the lights. I had gone only a short distance when I encountered a barbed wire fence, and I climbed over, tearing my coat in the process. As I said, it was dark and snowing heavily. I couldn't see where I was going or what was around me. I was driven only by the lights of the cabin or the farmhouse ahead. I thought I could vaguely see shapes moving around me, and I figured they must be horses or deer. I sure hoped they were friendly. The snow was so deep that I was struggling to break my way through it, and I tripped several times. The ground was also not flat, but seemed to have slight undulations, like small hills, although I couldn't distinguish them in the dark. Something, though, a branch maybe, caught my foot and flung me forward and knocked the wind right out of me. I lay there, gasping for breath, and suddenly, something large and furry picked me up. I screamed at the shock of seeing this thing come out of the dark at me. I thought it was a bear, a gigantic bear, and I knew it was just knew it was going to eat me. But this big beast just carried me in his arms, kicking and hitting and screaming all the way right up to that farmhouse. I thought it must be a monster. There were no other words for it. It was Godzilla in my young mind, but wasn't he in New York or somewhere in the jungle? It couldn't be a bear, not the way he was carrying me. My screams alerted the people in the house, and just as they opened the door, the big thing sat me down and ran off into the forest behind the house. A man was standing at the door holding a shotgun, and his wife pushed past him and ran to me, scooping me up in her arms. I was crying uncontrollably. They took me in, gave me a cup of hot cocoa, and attempted to call my mother. Well, the phone lines were down, and I found out later that the road had been closed just shortly after that snowplow had made its one pass. That's why there weren't any vehicles on the road. The wife wrapped me up in warm blankets while her husband set out to dig out their truck so he could drive me home. They considered having me spend the night and drive me home in the morning in the daylight, but they're afraid that my mom would panic and set out to find me, so once he had cleared the truck and the berms, they both loaded me into their truck and carefully made their way to my house, getting stuck a few times and having to dig out the truck. Now, like I mentioned before, this happened when I was 9 years old, back in 1969. We didn't talk about Bigfoot or Sasquatch much back then. I knew there were Yeti living in the Himalayas. I'd heard of Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest, but the Bigfoot craze had not occurred yet. History says that the Bigfoot legend originated back in the late 1800s or early 1900s, when North American settlers began reported sightings and finding footprints. It became a more popular subject when Ray Wallace, a road contractor working in Northern California, made plaster casts of giant footprints that he found near his work site, which later turned out to be a hoax. But since then, loggers in the Cascade Mountains reported seeing creatures and finding large tracks along logging roads, which further increased the public awareness of Bigfoot. Well, was it Bigfoot that carried me to that farmhouse door when I was a young girl? I'll never know for sure. But no other explanation exists for that big, dark, furry thing that carried me in his arms all the way to that farmhouse that night. Well, that's a good little story. I'd like to think that they're out there looking out for us instead of trying to maim us. Well, here's another story about a Bigfoot rescue that comes from a book. Name of the book is Rusty Wilson's 18-pack of Bigfoot Campfire Stories. Rusty's books can be found on Amazon, and he has a bunch of them. So if you like Bigfoot stories, I suggest heading over to Rusty Wilson's Amazon site. This story is called The Jaws of Life. We've all heard the statistics on how lots of people have car accidents, but I believe we're usually in denial that it could happen to us. At least I was, until the odds caught up with me. And I also believe that the odds of being rescued in the fashion I was are astronomical. I still have no idea why it all happened, but maybe there really isn't a reason. It's just how life is sometimes, how things come together. I am an audiologist with the Utah State Agency, and I was on my way to a little southeastern Utah town of Blanding to test some of the kids there. The state tries to get all the kids tested, and Blanding is close to the White Mountain Ute Reservation, so I would go down there periodically to test those little kids. I was based in Salt Lake, so it's a bit of a drive down there, about 300 miles, and I always have to spend a night or two away from home in a hotel. I think the fact that I decided to drive down there after work instead of waiting until the next day was why I ran off the road, as I was really tired. Well, once you get around 20 miles out of Monticello, a pretty little mountain town, not far north of Blanding, you come to a pretty good grade. I don't know what it's called, but I'm sure it has a name. It's like a small mountain pass and has a few good drop-offs. I was lucky that I ran off the inside of the road instead of the outside. It's rugged country. No houses or signs of human habitation for quite a ways. In fact, there's basically nothing for the entire 45 miles between Moab and Monticello. It was late when I got to this pass, which crosses the flanks of the Bajo Mountains, and it had been dark for a couple hours already, even though it was summer and the days were long. I've gone over that pass a lot of times in the winter, and it can be really icy. Plus, you have to watch out for deer. Well, the deer are usually up in the higher country in the summer, but sure enough, I came around the corner and standing right there in the middle of the road were two deer. My headlights blinded them, and they just stood there. I was going about 65. Fast enough I knew it would really damage my car if I hit them, not to mention the deer. I really sat on the brakes, burning rubber, but they just stood there, so my last recourse was to swerve. By then I'd probably slowed down to about 50, but it was still fast enough that I lost control. Basically, I just overcorrected. I remember when I was young and my dad was teaching me how to drive, he told me that overcorrecting was the cause of many accidents. So I was aware you should never do this. But I was really tired. My judgment was just off. I'll never forget the feeling of flying off the highway and literally catching air as I went over an embankment, crashing through the aspens and landing down below. My final thoughts were, okay, now I know how I'm going to die. I wasn't particularly afraid. I just knew that it was the end, and I wondered if they would ever find my body down there in them trees down below the highway. That's all I remember, and I don't know how long I was unconscious. I must have hit my head on the steering wheel because I was definitely knocked out. I woke up with something warm and sticky running down my face, and I could smell blood. I sat there for a while, not even sure who I was or where I was, when I gradually began to recall what had happened. By golly, I was surprised I was still alive. I reached up, I could feel there was a big cut on my forehead. That was the source of the blood in my face. I then kind of did a body check to see if I had any real injuries. I could feel my shoulders and my neck aching, so I figured I had a bit of a whiplash, but everything else seemed okay. I was glad I'd been wearing my seatbelt, but I felt all twisted around for some reason. I reached over and I managed to unhook my seatbelt. Then I got my jacket from the back seat and I held it to my head, finally stopping the bleeding. Even though that cut hurt like heck, I could tell it was really just a surface wound. Since surface wounds bleed a lot, it took a while before I could get it stopped, and my jacket was just soaked with blood. But I did. I got it stopped, and I was beginning to think I was going to be okay and I was going to survive. My next thoughts were that I needed to get out of the car and back up on the highway where somebody would see me and help me. I was a little woozy and groggy from hitting my head, but I knew I had to get out. Okay, now came the hard part. The car had landed on its side, and that just happened to be the driver's side, so there was no way I could open that door to get out. That's why I felt all twisted around. I was basically on my side. The car seemed to be dead. When I turned the key, the automatic window opener wouldn't work. I was going to have to crawl up to the passenger door and force it open while gravity held it down. But I was driving a little two-door Honda, so I didn't think it would be too difficult, as the door wasn't like some big heavy pickup door or something. But climbing up the car wasn't easy. I kept sliding back down into the driver's seat. I couldn't get any leverage to open the door. Every time I would slide back, I would ache and hurt even more. I was still fighting wanting to go to sleep from the concussion I got when I hit that steering wheel. Now, after about a half dozen tries, I finally managed to wedge myself into the seat enough to be able to reach up and unlock the door, then push on it. But nothing happened. It wouldn't budge. Okay, I next managed to turn myself around and use my feet to push, using a lot of force. But you know what? That didn't work either. Now, I don't know how many times and angles and ways I tried to open that door, but it just wasn't of any use. It was stuck. There was nothing I could do to open it. I just crumpled back down into the driver's side and I started crying. It was all just too much. I couldn't believe I was stuck in my own car, down in a ravine off the highway where nobody could see me. I must have drifted off, because when I woke again it was daylight. Man, I was really stiff and sore from the bruising I'd got. The cut on my head throbbed. I was getting a pretty bad headache. I needed to get out of that car. I was starting to feel desperate. I knew my only recourse at this point was to break out the window. I started looking around for some tool to use, but I didn't see anything. I was starting to get a little claustrophobic and a little bit panicky. On top of that, I was hungry and I was thirsty. I knew they'd be missing me at the clinic, but they would have no idea where to look, and I couldn't find anything to break the window with. I just sat there. It's all sinking in. Instead of dying in a car crash, I was going to die of thirst and starvation. I had only about 3 or 4 days to sit there and slowly let that sink in. I'm a realist. I had no illusions about what was ahead of me. It was going to be a really bad way to go. Well, I guess that thought motivated me because I found myself desperately trying to break the automatic shift lever off the steering wheel assembly. I eventually was able to kick it off with my feet. How I twisted around to do that's beyond me, as I felt like I was sitting in a hole, and even trying to move was getting difficult from being so stiff and cold. Okay, now I had a tool, a big plastic stick-like thing, the shifter. I managed to climb back up enough to start whacking on the window with it. But of course, safety glass isn't easy to break, and that stick had no effect at all. I tried over and over to break that window. Then I tried the front glass with the same effect. That seemed even thicker. So I gave up on that and went back to trying to break the side window. After numerous attempts, I crumpled back into a heap and cried. I need something metal, but there wasn't anything at all in the car. I was stuck. It was hopeless. I needed to rest again after all that effort. I could feel myself getting weaker. Now I just sat there, drifting in and out of unconsciousness, thinking of my life and all the stupid mistakes I'd made, and wondering why I had to die like this. I was only 43 years old. I had a husband, 2 kids at home. I wondered if they would do okay without me. I just sat there all day, thinking like that between bouts of trying to break out that window and yelling for help, even though I knew no one could hear me through that closed window. Now I tried everything, even kicking the glass. Nothing worked. I just couldn't get enough leverage and it was too far above me. I was desperate, but there was nothing I could do. And to make things worse, it was getting hot and stuffy in that car. I hoped someone would maybe see my skid marks and come looking for me, but nobody came. It was the longest day of my life, and it changed me completely. I must have went to sleep again, because when I woke up it was dark. I was now terribly thirsty and the heat in the car was bad. I was very lightheaded at this point, and what happened next I would say wasn't real. Except it had to be, as there's no other reason that I'm here and alive now. But at the time I thought, well, this is what happens when you die of dehydration. Your mind starts playing weird tricks on you. Makes you think you're going to be rescued, but you're not. It's all from your brain shutting down, so don't get your hopes up. I have no idea what time of night it was, but it had to be late. I could see the stars directly above me through the passenger window. I sat there, kind of twisted sideways, looking at the stars, when something blocked my view. Normally, this would have scared me to death, but since I figured I was already a goner, I just felt a simple curiosity. What had looked in there and blocked my view of the stars? Now it was back and I could make out the outline of a very large head, barely backlit by the millions of stars in the clear night sky. I sat there, looking at it as it studied me, and I could tell it was covered with hair from the way it looked all fuzzy. It appeared to have no ears, and it was big. That head filled up the entire window. Okay, what happened next would normally terrify me, but this thing suddenly had glowing red eyes where it hadn't before. Now its eyes were kind of radiating out this bright red light. It seemed to light up the car. It was like it had two glowing cigarette lighters in its head. I knew it was studying me and trying to figure me out, and now there was another big head looking in. So there were two of them, I thought, wondering what they made of this whole deal. A helpless human in a wrecked car, unable to hardly even move. Now the next part really scared me. Suddenly the car began to rock, with me rocking inside with it, back and forth. I was totally terrified. But soon the car was righted. These creatures had sat my car back on its wheels, and how they did that I have no idea, yet alone why. Were they trying to help me, or were they going to eat me? This took a while to set in, for me to realize what had happened. I was no longer scrunched down against the driver's door, but sat up like one normally would in a car. It was a huge relief to have the pressure gone. I tried to open the driver's door, but it was totally crumpled inward from the crash and it just wouldn't budge. I tried the passenger door again. No luck. In my frustration, I started kicking it as hard as I could, yelling and cussing. This ended in another bout of hopeless tears. But suddenly, I could hear the sound of metal tearing. The car door was being pulled off. These creatures pulled that door off like you or I would pop the flip top of a can. Fresh air flowed into the car and was so sweet I could taste it. I could breathe again. And now I was free. I scooted over and I looked out of the car and I didn't see anything. But I had goosebumps on my arms. Whatever they were gone. It was still dark, and now I began to wonder if I should try to climb that hill or wait till daylight. I decided to wait. The next morning, I woke early, extremely thirsty and hungry, managed to drag myself up the slope, where a man in a passing car stopped and helped me. After a few days in the hospital in Monticello, I was soon on my way home with my husband. I later received a call from the patrolman who investigated the accident, and he asked a lot of questions. He was especially interested in how that car door was wrenched off and thrown 20 feet away. I just told him someone came by and helped me, but I don't remember much about it. Not long after that, I had a journalist call me. When she asked me how the car door had been wrenched off, I just told her I was in shock and I don't remember. But someone had helped me out. The accident I was in made the front page of the Salt Lake newspaper. The headline read, "Woman mysteriously rescued from wrecked car by strangers." Well, they may be strangers, but I hope they stay mysterious forever. There are some creatures out there who are better off hidden, and I will forever be grateful for that pair who cared enough to save my life and give me a second chance. Well, even help from somebody like a Bigfoot. That's all good help if it saves your life. But boy, that would be a little strange now, wouldn't it? And any of you ever had something like that happen? I would hope that you'd tell me about it. That'd be interesting to hear. I guess this story kind of reminds you to be thankful. Be thankful for what we have, and the friends that we have, and the people around us. Because life is a gift, every single day. Now, until next time I see you, you guys be really good out there and be careful. Watch them deer in the road. This is Clay Steele. Good night.